It's finally here. This is the full review of Chaos by Tom O'Neill. We did a discussion episode just a couple episodes back, or maybe it was the last episode, where we talked about just some topics that were related to the book, but this is the actual full review and breakdown of the book itself. Now, it's massive. It covers a lot of information, so we will go through quite a bit of it, but not everything. I used to try to go through everything, but that would make these episodes monsters. So we are going to first talk about the background, then we'll go through the contents of the book, and then go through some reviews of the book, see what some other people have said about it. Then do an analysis and a big picture to wrap it into a wider understanding of the world. Thank everybody who has been bearing with me as we go through some different kinds of structures for these episodes. It takes a tremendous amount of time to read these books a couple of times and outline and record and edit and all that stuff. So having a very compelling and demanding day job makes it difficult to do that. But we are here at least for this one. This is, again, Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s, published 2019 by Tom O'Neill with Dan Peppenbring. Tom O'Neill was an entertainment journalist, I believe, at the time. When it was originally begun, it began as a 3-month magazine assignment for Premiere Magazine in 1999. So it started as that. It was just supposed to be a little story that he was writing that was supposed to be about Hollywood after the Manson murders and what effect that's had. But then it turned into this obsessive story about the Manson murders themselves and everybody who was involved and some of the questionable things that happened during it. So the title of the book comes from Operation Chaos. It was a CIA domestic espionage project targeting American citizens that operated from 1967 to 1974, established by LBJ and expanded under Nixon. So the purpose of the operation was to uncover possible foreign influence on domestic race, anti-war, and other protest movements. So it was targeted domestically, but it was from the CIA. CIA, of course, is supposed to be focused on things outside of the country, while the FBI is focused inside the country. But this was a CIA operation that was targeting Americans. So that's what the title comes from. And the general structure of the book and what the book is really doing is questioning the official story that was proffered by the lead prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi, the helter-skelter idea of the motivation for Manson to commit the murders that he did. So Helter Skelter was the book that was published in 1974 by Vincent Bugliosi that chronicled the Manson murders and what he did to put them in prison. But what this author suggests, Tom O'Neill, is that there were a whole bunch of other things that were going on and that were left out and that implicate a whole bunch of other people related to these murders and other criminal activities and constitutional violations and all sorts of other really, really terrible things that were kind of swept under the rug to just get this prosecution done on these supposedly lone criminals. So the book itself is a result of 20 years of research and hundreds of interviews. This guy has been doing this for a very long time. It really turned into like that Zodiac movie where he was obsessed with it for 2 decades and he just kept passing deadline after deadline after deadline. He was getting money from the publisher for years and years and years without producing anything. He was just following every strand that he could find. And eventually, obviously it came out in 2019. The song itself, this is incredibly interesting to me, at least. The Helter Skelter song is a Beatles song, and it's named after an amusement park ride in Britain. It's this tall spiral slide that rides around a tower, and they named it after that. And it was supposed to be kind of a rebuff of the critics who were saying that the Beatles didn't do anything that was, edgy. They always did things that were maudlin and that kind of thing. So this was a rebuff to that. It was called Helter Skelter. The song, I listened to it yesterday. It was an interesting song. And Charles Manson, interpreted the song as a coded message from the Beatles about a race war, an impending race war, and the apocalypse. And he viewed the Beatles as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So many interesting things. It's kind of crazy. So anyway, I think that's enough background. We can go into a lot of the contents of the book. So the book is structured around following all of these threads related to all the different people who were involved in the case, like the prosecutor, the defense attorney, various people who knew Manson at various times, and people who were in the CIA. Oh, we can't even go into that yet. But anyway, where it starts, we can start with the murder itself. So people probably have seen in various media dramatizations of the murder, or they've read Helter Skelter and see descriptions of it. Many movies and documentaries and that kind of thing have been made about this murder. Most recently, fantastic movie, and I know I talked about it. I've talked about it multiple times, but Once Upon a Time in Hollywood was the alternate history of the Manson murders of Sharon Tate and her friends. And it has definitely been something, the Manson murders have definitely been something that have been in the zeitgeist for a long time. The details are brutal. The details of the actual murder are very brutal. If you read Helter Skelter, or in this book, there's a reproduction of a lot of the actual details of the murder. Tate was, of course, she was 8.5 months pregnant with Roman Polanski's baby at the time, and pleaded with her attackers to let her live long enough just to give birth, and offered herself as a hostage in an attempt to save the life of her unborn child. The thing that stuck out to me was when they entered the house and the people were trying to figure out what was going on, why they were there, what they were doing, what their motivation was, and they couldn't figure it out. It wasn't money. One of them gave them money, and the people didn't just try to ransack the house or steal anything, but the purpose when they were there was to just wreak havoc and cause carnage and kill people. There was a certain point in the struggle where somebody realized that, okay, this wasn't one of those things where you can just try to be calm and wait for them to enact whatever they're going to enact and leave so you can survive. They were there and they were murdering people just out of compulsion, and the way that they would do it was like, somebody says something, somebody moves in the wrong way or something like that. That person gets shot, that person gets stabbed, and that's how it was happening. Tate herself, while pregnant, was stabbed by two of the perpetrators 16 times. But it was found that the coroner found that Tate was actually still alive when she was hanged by this nylon rope around her neck. The cause of death was determined to be a massive hemorrhage, but in a similar vein, Jay Sebring, her friend, who was a pioneer actually when it came to cutting hair, he was one of the first people who had the idea of going into people's homes and cutting hair there. So he was cutting a lot of very wealthy people's hair, and he was previously in a relationship with Sharon Tate, but they remained friends, and so he would hang around a lot with Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate. There were a lot of weird things that were going on with this relationship and with everything that happened. But anyway, so both of them end up hanged. Sebring was dead before he was hanged, but he was also hanged there. And there were a couple of other friends who were there. I think Quincy Jones, who was actually a friend of Jay Sebring, the producer Quincy Jones, was supposed to go that night, but for some reason wasn't able to go. And so it turned out, apparently, that according to Tex Watson, who was one of the perpetrators, he said that Manson had told the women to leave a sign, something witchy. So he just said, you have to go kill these people and leave a sign, something witchy. And one of them, Atkins, wrote pig on the front door in Tate's blood. Atkins claimed that she did this to copycat a murder scene of a compatriot of theirs. They called themselves the Family. They were at this ranch all together, all these hippies. If you saw the movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, you get an idea of it. But they were all at this ranch, and they called themselves the Family, which is archetypally very interesting. But there was one of them who had committed this murder. Gary Hinman was the victim. And so in Hinman's blood, the perpetrator, Beausoleil, I think it's French, had written political piggy in Hinman's blood on the wall after stabbing it to death. So for Atkins, at least ostensibly, she was saying that when she wrote pig in blood in Sharon Tate's blood on the door, then that would make it seem like the killer, whoever, Bobby Beausoleil, couldn't have been the killer because somebody else killed somebody in the same way. So they would have to let him out because, the killer must be out there because they're doing the same thing. So that was the ostensible reason for her doing that. But yeah, so they lots of stabbings and shootings. One person at one point had broken themselves free and ran out the front door, but was caught by Tex Watson, and he hit them with the butt of the gun multiple times and killed them. It was an absolutely gruesome murder. It was one of those things that shook the world at the time. And I think it's something that's so resonant because it didn't seem like it had a reason. That's something that people are able to get their heads around. If there's a murder and it's in the commission of a robbery, or it's based on jealousy or just some kind of hatred or something like that, then it's something that makes sense. But in this particular murder, there was no clear motive. It didn't make any sense. It was, why would this happen to these people? Why would these people be motivated to do that? So it was something that really resonated at the time and has ever since. Moving into Manson's history, the book goes into talking about the history of Charles Manson, where he came from, what his childhood was like, and the people that he engaged with. So his parents apparently got into a lot of criminal behavior and ended up in jail. His mom, he said the happiest time of his life was when his mom got out of prison, and I think they spent like a week together or something when he was young, and that was the happiest time that he ever had. But he was eventually sent to a very strict boarding type school with very severe punishment for even the smallest infractions. So you'd get beatings, and there would be like a wooden paddle or a leather strap that the children would be beaten with. And this is around age 13 that he was in the school. And so he ran away from it multiple times. One time he ran away and he would just sleep in the woods or under bridges or wherever else he could find shelter. He had early run-ins with the law. There was a certain time, I think his first criminal act was he stole some stuff out of a store, and he found this little box that had like $100 in it, which was a significant amount of money at the time. But then he would engage in petty thefts after that would get more and more serious. And eventually, over time, at one point, I think he picked up a hitchhiker, and the hitchhiker happened to have connections to the music production industry and the Beach Boys. So at a certain point, he actually wrote a song that the Beach Boys would use, even though it was credited to another writer. It was actually written by Manson and I believe the family, like people that he was staying with at the time. But they wrote a song for the Beach Boys. And I listened to that song as well yesterday. Never Learn Not to Love is what I think the Beach Boys single was called. And it's a little creepy. If you listen to it, it's kind of strange. And then there's also a Charles Manson version that wasn't altered, and it's called Cease to Exist. But both of them have some really weird lyrics. Like there's, at one point it says, cease to exist, give up your world. It's supposed to be singing to a girl that's telling her to give up her world and commit to somebody so blindly. And especially in light of what would come later, that's something that seemed crazy. There were also other allegations that the author tried to find all these connections. Like there was this particular doctor that was doing experiments with LSD, and the allegation was that he experimented on Manson with this LSD, and then Manson would later use that on his followers. And it was part of this program. I should have a whole section just on the program, obviously, but it was part of this program, this government program, that we will talk. I'm just going to plug it in somewhere. Maybe we'll talk about Roman Polanski, and then we'll talk about the government programs before we go into the prosecutor. But yeah, so Manson had a lot of these weird connections, and he was a very weird guy and got into a lot of criminal trouble. But eventually ended up, in the Hollywood area, in San Francisco at some point, and LA area, and was meeting with and engaging with a lot of these very powerful, very upper crust music producers and musicians that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but he ended up there. So Roman Polanski himself was also a very weird guy. If you've seen his movies, obviously you know a lot about that. I think his most recent movie that I watched was very tame by comparison. It was one with Ewan McGregor. Has anybody seen that? It was an Ewan McGregor one, and it also had Pierce Brosnan in it. And he plays like a writer that is writing about this politician. And there's a bunch of corruption in the background. And of course, Ewan McGregor gets naked because he loves doing that in every movie. But it was an interesting movie. I watched it a couple of times. Actually, a really interesting movie. But Roman Polanski obviously did Rosemary's Baby, and he did Chinatown, and some of the bigger movies and stranger movies that came out at the time. I think he also did The Pianist. Was that one of his movies that was very well regarded and heralded? But he fled the United States. This was after the Tate murders, but he fled the United States after being accused of some very heinous crimes, and he didn't want to stand trial for them, so he fled and has been in another country that will not extradite him to the United States ever since. But they were very heinous crimes. There were a lot of allegations also related to Sharon Tate after her murder that came out, that her friends talked about Roman Polanski was at least emotionally abusive and would not just try, but he would force her to engage in acts that were not, I'll say, they were not appropriate for the marital context. So he was very controlling apparently as well. He would tell her what to wear, and among other things, he said, and this isn't a weird thing, I just thought it was an interesting tidbit. He said that he liked that she was a very good cook and that she could cut his hair, that she had learned from Jay Sebring. And of course, he kept around Sebring, even though they previously, Tate and Sebring, had a relationship. So it's not standard kind of relationship. He allegedly as well would have these intense and crazy sex parties that were recorded in the book, that were talked about in the book. There were some where there were these allegations that some really crazy stuff happened. And some people that the author talked to would say, yeah, that happened and it was crazy. And other people would say, no, that never happened. None of that stuff ever happened. But apparently there were these mass orgies and things that they would have with Roman Polanski that he would set up. So he was a pretty weird guy. I don't know how many of these have been vetted and verified, but he just seems like a weird guy. If you've seen Rosemary's Baby, you already know he's a weird freaking guy. There were also some suspicious things about his associations prior to her murder that the author goes into. There are so many theories related to this damn murder. It is crazy, and we are not going to be able to go through all of them. Yeah, there were some theories about Roman Polanski's involvement in a lot of the way this whole thing has happened. I know there were some people who said that Roman Polanski wanted her to get an abortion when he found out she was pregnant, but she resisted it. So your mind can run with that, obviously. And the guy who originally lived, we'll come to him. Terry Melcher was another significant person in this. So after Roman Polanski, I said we were going to talk about the actual government programs. And most of these, a lot of people have already heard of. But the primary one that is related to this is the MK Ultra program, and this is something that it's been declassified now, a lot of information about it, and it was something that was extremely questionable. Not just questionable, it was completely illegal. But it was the CIA doing experiments and trying to figure out how to control people, how to use them either via hypnosis or using substances or just psychologically, how they would be able to manipulate people to use them as sleeper cells or to use them as agents of their own. They believe that the Russians were engaging in this. I don't know if that little tidbit was used to try to be a defense of it, but yeah, they were doing a lot of experimental stuff on people, and a lot of it was using LSD. There was a particular doctor who actually was the expert in this, in trying to use LSD to manipulate people. And weirdly, there were some ties to Charles Manson and the Manson family. They would go to this one particular clinic, and they went there a lot of times. That was I think it was in LA or it was in Hollywood or somewhere. And they went to this place a lot, and it turned out that one of the doctors who was part of this program, who was using LSD to try to manipulate people, happened to also get a grant and work at this particular clinic. And then there were a lot of allegations that Manson was trying to use LSD to control people, a lot of his followers. And Manson himself, we didn't talk about this in his history, but he would hold, obviously, a lot of questionable sexual encounters wherein there were questions around consent, and he would force people to do things that were sexually beyond their interests or comfort zones, so that it's a kind of purchase that they would have to have in these activities so that they would be dependent emotionally and psychologically on him. So, and this would, men, women, it didn't matter. He was doing these kinds of things and forcing them to do things in front of other people to force them to be engaged with, the cult itself. So there was a lot of that weird stuff going on at this time. Of course, this is the late 60s. So it is, and we'll talk about that in the big picture part, but it was the late 60s. So there was a lot of that kind of thing going on because psychologically there was a lot of collateral damage from the fallout after the Vietnam War. But anyway, beyond that, so there was this MK Ultra program where they were trying to learn how to manipulate people in effective ways, and they were doing this on citizens, and it was completely illegal, and it was the CIA that was trying to do this, and eventually it was exposed and shut down. How shut down is it really? What are they doing nowadays? But still, and there were a lot of ties. There was also this one really crazy tie where, I think it's actually, when I go into the reviews, it's discussed by somebody. Yeah, we'll talk about that in the reviews. Okay. But moving on from there, the prosecutor, Vincent Bugliosi. So this was the prosecutor who was trying to put the Manson family in jail after the murders. And there were a lot of weird things that went on related to this. So the prosecutor had a concept of the case, and the concept of the case was that the helter-skelter murders were about trying to incite a race war. That was the motive. So Manson had control over his followers, such great control that he can get them to go do this just to incite the race war. They wanted the police to believe that it was Black Panthers or something like that who were the perpetrators, and so it would incite this race war. It would be in line with the Helter Skelter song that he believed was a secret code to incite a race war and bring on the apocalypse. And so this was the theory of the case, and that's why the murders happened. The house itself had previously belonged to Terry Melcher, who, God, we needed there so much, who we will talk about in a minute here. But so the idea was for Vincent Bugliosi was that the Manson murders happened, and Manson sent them in there because he was trying to incite a race war. It didn't really matter who the people were. It was just kill those pigs, put up a witchy sign, make a witchy scene so that you can incite this race war. And that was the point. And so the prosecutor, though, as part of his prosecution, left out a whole bunch of very relevant facts, like people visiting the crime scene or visiting Manson afterwards. Like Manson actually, he was out on probation and he got just really lax probation management, including the fact that he would get picked up for these crimes and then just let free without, being considered having violated his probation and thrown back in jail. There was this insane bust. It was the largest in history, and it was downplayed by a lot of the papers and by Bugliosi. It was downplayed, but it was the largest in history at the time, where they had, SWAT teams and all that kind of thing, the stakeouts, just following Manson and the family for doing something that had nothing to do with the murders. It was like they were stealing cars and doing a bunch of other stuff that was questionable, but it was this whole crime syndicate that he was undertaking at the time. So they were surveilling him and watching all this and building a case, and then they execute this warrant and they go in and they arrest all the people, and it's like, okay, all that work that we put in, we finally got to arrest the people that we needed to arrest, the Manson and his family, his followers, for stealing these cars and doing a bunch of other stuff like that, but it had nothing to do with the murders. And they were let out, just completely let out, and the charges were dropped after this whole thing. So there are very strong reasons to believe that Manson had some kind of connection to law enforcement or the FBI or the CIA or something, because it doesn't make any sense that he would be let out after that. And this was after the murders had occurred, and so they had to go later, like a couple months later or something, they had to go pick them all up again and charge them with the actual murders. But prior to that, it just didn't make any sense. There were a lot of times where he'd engage in criminal activity, and he just was the luckiest human being on earth that he didn't get a probation violation and sent back to jail for 10 plus years for having done that. And so it was just happening over and over and over again. And it was to the point where there was the co-prosecutor on the case. So there was Vincent Bugliosi and there was Stephen Kay, the co-prosecutor. And he was looking at the handwritten notes on Vincent Bugliosi that were discovered by Tom O'Neill, the author of this book, and he was showing these handwritten notes that said that people had visited the crime scene afterwards, and there were all sorts of weird things going on. And the co-prosecutor said that he was so shocked by the notes and that it would likely be enough to overturn all the verdicts against Manson and the family. It was that bad, the kinds of things that were left out of the prosecution and the defense. And there were a lot of particulars around this, but it really is like Zodiac. Like, you have to really follow all the things that are happening. I read this twice and read up on it a ton after. I read a whole bunch of reviews and summaries and all those kinds of things afterwards. So anyway, you've got this, and on the other side, you've got the defense attorney who was supposed to be, he's this brilliant guy, but now he was completely destitute. The author goes and picks him up at some point, and he got the distinct sense that the guy was homeless, and he was like really weird and wiry, and so he took him from one place and dropped him off at this other place where it seemed like he was going to the shelter. It was like, this was the former defense attorney for Charles Manson, and there are a lot of weird things going on. But so then there is Terry Melcher. Terry Melcher was a producer and the only son of Doris Day, the actress. And he was very successful. He did very well for himself. And it turned out that Manson actually auditioned for Terry Melcher, but Melcher declined to sign him. And there were a bunch of other projects, too, that he was going to make about the people at Spawn Ranch and the family and Charles Manson, but he decided not to follow any of the projects. So Manson was very angry about this. And so this could have been part of the motivation for Manson to go to that house and try to find Terry Melcher to get revenge on him. But Melcher was very, very cagey about giving information related to this. And one of the biggest things that I haven't brought up yet, and what could be part of the explanation, no celebrity would talk to this guy, even just about, in general, the Manson family and everything. And they could have been afraid on one side, obviously, of maybe if I talk about this, then I'll get retribution from some of these other cultish maniacs. But on the other side of it, it seems like, and it could have been, that Manson was trying to entrap or trying to get the ability to blackmail very powerful and famous people, either on his behalf or on the behalf of some other entity, because he would enlist all of these underage girls, and he would use these underage girls to seduce a bunch of these very powerful people. Some of the powerful people, some producers and that kind of thing, would go to the ranch and they would stay with them, or they would have a bunch of these underage girls over at their houses, and Manson and the girls would stay there for an extended period of time. And so one of the theories was that Manson was actually enlisted by one of these organizations to get these underage girls and have them engage in whatever with a lot of these powerful people, and then use that as leverage against these powerful people. Obviously, we haven't heard that before. That's certainly something that is very much within the realm of possibility. But now, up to this point, this was 1999 when he started this investigation. This was already 20 years later or longer after all this stuff had concluded. And so a lot of the people who were involved, he would get a couple of conversations with them, but they would die soon after. And it was a 20-year investigation, but a lot of the people died in the course of it that he was trying to talk to. So many people were just really weird about what was going on. Vincent Bugliosi himself threatened him over and over and over again. If you say this or you do this, or who are you talking to, who are you not talking to, and I will sue you for $100 million. I'm going to put you in the poorhouse, etc., for chasing all these leads. But there were so many people who were involved and so many questions that remained. And there were no concrete answers about any of it. This was something that it was being investigated so long after the fact. And he was finding out so much more stuff that nobody had known about or nobody had publicized. And there were a lot of interests involved and a lot of really, really weird connections. And so I just highly recommend read this book. It's one of those, I think true crime is the easiest to read at any time. You're always in the mood for true crime. It's fun to read. And I hate to say, obviously there were a lot of horrible victims involved, and just psychologically so many things happened. And it was such a blow collectively that it's not great to take it lightly, but still it's like I said, totally worth the read. So moving into the reviews, The Guardian said, during his long slog, O'Neill encounters a series of bogeys who would be at home in one of Raymond Chandler's novels. They include Manson's defense lawyer, now a shambling, toothless derelict with a briefcase held together by string, a prison inmate known as Pincushion because of his uncountable stab wounds, and a CIA scientist who killed an elephant called Tusco by injecting it with 1,400 times the dosage of acid that produces marked mental disturbance in humans. There was a lot of weird stuff going on with everything related to this case. The Denver Post said it couldn't be the case that the truth involved a drug burn gone wrong. That was another theory. That I totally forgot to mention, is this drug dealing that happened that had gone wrong at some point, and it was one of the theories for why they were killed, because Jay Sebring and some of his associates who were involved in drugs and drug dealing and some other shady stuff. It was just a revenge based on that, and they got Manson and his followers to do it. But so it couldn't be the case that the truth involved a drug burn gone wrong, orgies with Hollywood elite, a counterinsurgency trained CIA infiltrator in the family, a series of unusually lax sheriff's deputies and district attorneys and judges and parole officers, an FBI plot to smear leftists and Black Panthers, an effort to see if research on drugged mice applied to hippies, and LSD mind-controlled experiments tested in the field. Could it? O'Neill writes, so this was the Denver Post referencing something that he had said, that all those things were involved with this. And so it's like, could all those things really be involved in this particular murder plot? And they follow it up with, but you don't need to be a career journalist to enjoy chaos. The story will entertain anyone with an interest in true crime, pop culture, music, 1960s psychedelia, the most secret levels of the American government, and yes, conspiracy theories, including a connection to the JFK assassination. And I remembered little about this actual connection, so I had to look it up. Book page said this is what the connection was. Another line of investigation took O'Neill from Los Angeles to San Francisco. The Manson family first formed in the city's Hot Ashbury neighborhood. Manson and his girls were frequent visitors to the Hot Ashbury Free Clinic. The doctors there received government funding to study the effects of psychedelics and mind control. In his assiduous research, O'Neill uncovered that one of the doctors there, Jolly West, a CIA contractor, did a jailhouse psychological profile of Jack Ruby, who shot and killed Lee Harvey Oswald, the assassin of President John F. Kennedy. So there were a lot of weird connections that make for a lot of questions around this whole murder. So moving on to the analysis, how do you analyze this? So there were a lot of different theories, like I said. Manson as an asset for blackmail with the underage girls and everything. Manson as a vector for MK Ultra experimentation with the LSD. Manson angry about being snubbed by a producer and wanting revenge. Manson trying to incite a race war. Manson and his followers were just plain lunatics and doing lunatic kind of things. There were lots and lots of theories. It's a long book. It has lots of details. You get lost in the particulars on the first read. It's hard to follow the significance of each player. There are hundreds of interviews, but like I said, I thought it was entertaining throughout. My personal theory when it comes to Manson is that it was opportunistic. This was a very messed up guy, and I think there was some kind of government involvement, that they had an asset that they could use to do a lot of weird things. And LSD and experimenting with being able to control people with LSD certainly might have been one of it. Manson had his own methods for being able to control people, and it might have been worth it for the government just to analyze those methods. But I think LSD certainly was a big part of it, and he likely had some kind of government contact that was keeping him out of prison for a very long time until the murders became so high profile that there was nothing else to be done about it. And that explains why a lot of the people involved were so cagey. That explains why they were so focused on this one particular narrative about what the murders were about, and why so much of the Hollywood elite were so disinclined to comment on it or be involved in any way. There was likely some kind of blackmail material out there. There were likely some kind of government involvement in this kind of experimentation and LSD, because the guy had so much. That was another thing, is that it wasn't just the cars that he was found with. He had tons of weapons, guns up the you know what. So there were a lot of questions, and we may never find out. We may find out after everybody involved is dead. A lot of them just died in between 2010 and 2020. A lot of the people who were involved died. So we may get information from them, or from sources that would otherwise have been unwilling to give the information, or we never hear about any of it again. Who knows? Big picture wise, like I said, one of the biggest issues was that after the Vietnam War, it really called to question the strongest and most prevalent paternal figure, which was the government itself. And people will seek guidance. They will seek it out. We're not built as humans. We're not built for a broad bureaucracy to be our source of authority. That's not how we lived it for a very, very long time. It's just this composite of the ways that we functioned prior to that, where we would have a paternal figure who gives us guidance and tells us what to do, and we'd question and we'd go along and we'd respect or we'd challenge. That kind of dynamic existed at the time. But it wasn't on the scale that the government itself was. And once the government lost its authority and its paternal authority after the Vietnam War, then you had the 60s. You had the people rebelling against it collectively in such a way as we'd never seen before. And a lot of that contributed to people being willing to engage in the hippie lifestyle, for one. It was that psychological collateral damage after Vietnam, but also to really test the boundaries of what people could do. And part of that would have been the kinds of people who acted in these cultish ways and were willing to murder celebrities to make a point, or just because they were lunatics. So yeah, that is Chaos. That's the full review of the book itself. There is plenty of content in here. We could have talked about it for hours upon hours. And I will likely have another discussion episode related to it, so it just takes a topic out of it and goes with it. But beyond that, yeah, it's going to be some movies that I have seen recently that I want to talk about, and some other things that have come up. And I appreciate everybody who has listened to one of these things. I know with all of the content in the effing universe right now, it's unbelievable. And I just really wanted a pocket where we were genuinely talking about important things instead of all the nonsense that ends up on podcasts and on YouTube and X and wherever else. So I just wanted something where we talked about really interesting ideas and covered important books, and it was a space to really think critically, carefully, and comprehensively about really important ideas. So anyway, yeah, I appreciate it. Hope all is well, and I'll see you on the next one.